Okay, so today we're on page 61, and we're actually going to be finishing up our genetics unit by looking at some diseases that you can inherit potentially from your parents, or when you're an adult, that you can actually pass on to your children. This section of notes talking about genetic disorders also goes along with our next unit when we start talking about technology, pedigrees, family trees. And so we're really going to use more of this information in our next unit, Unit 3.4, versus Unit 3.3 that we've just finished up, talking about all the different types of Punnett squares and all the different types of inheritance. But for this section of notes, we are talking about some specific diseases that you'll need to know. What you'll need to keep in mind is whether or not this disease is dominant or recessive. So how can it be passed on? And you want to know a few details about it that we have really highlighted here already for you. The first disease that you want to know about is Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is actually found on chromosome 4, so later on when we look at a picture of a karyotype, all of the chromosomes spread out and put in order, that'll come into play. It actually causes the brain to break down. So if you look in this picture, you see a normal brain, and here you can actually see a significant portion of the brain cell that's actually been broken down. And so you're actually losing brain cells, and that causes a loss of muscle coordination. And one thing that's interesting about this disease is that your symptoms often appear in your 40s. You've had this disease your whole life. It's been in your genome, in your DNA your whole life, but you don't really see symptoms until you're in your 40s. The pattern of inheritance here is that it's a dominant disorder. So that's the main big thing about this disease. It is dominant, and it's actually going to be the only dominant disorder that we talk about. The second disease is sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is when your red blood cells, instead of being normal shapes like a donut, it actually looks like a sickle or like a crescent moon, okay? And this causes poor circulation and pain to people that suffer from this disease. It is an autosomal co-dominant disorder, and that's, remember, when we had two different letters representing that. If you're heterozygous, that does allow you to be resistant to malaria, which we've talked about in our previous section. And this disease is actually found predominantly in African Americans. We will be mentioning a couple of other diseases that are more specific to specific groups of people. It just affects more people. But one thing to keep in mind is malaria. There's a high number of people that get infected by malaria in southern Africa. So because of that, there has actually been an advantage to being heterozygous for sickle cell anemia because that helps you survive. So think about why would that mean that more people that are African American have this disease. Okay? But we do have some other diseases that affect other groups of people. Here's actually a list of symptoms of Huntington's disease. There's lots and lots of symptoms related to this disease that we'll explore more in class. But another disease that we need to know about is cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is when your actual lung cells, there's an increase in mucus. And what this causes is, it actually causes you to not be able to breathe very well. Diffusion doesn't happen as easily through a lung cell that contains a lot of mucus. And the same as with
Miss Casey, please call the front office. Miss Casey, please call the front office.
This is a recessive disorder, and this disease actually affects primarily Caucasians. And so again, here we're seeing that certain diseases do have a pattern of inheritance. How do they actually get the disease, recessive or dominant? And we also see that it's affecting different groups of people as well. Another disease that we need to know about that is also autosomal recessive is Tay-Sachs disease. And Tay-Sachs disease is where we break down the central nervous system. So you actually break down your nerves, your brain cells, and actually breaks down your brain itself as well. This disease usually causes premature death, so children that have this will actually usually die before the age of 2. It's, again, recessive, and it's actually found predominantly in the Jewish population, okay? The 5th disease that we need to know about is called phenylketonuria, okay? But you're not expected to be able to say or even know the whole name. You do need to know that for shorthand, it's called PKU. PKU is the inability to break down the amino acid, phenylalanine. In our previous unit when we worked with protein synthesis, we saw Phe or Phen as the abbreviation. In this disease, what happens if you have this amino acid, a lot of it's found in milk, if you have this amino acid, your body isn't able to break it down. So it builds up in the brain, and when it builds up in the brain, it can actually cause a decrease in mental function. It actually kind of poisons the brain and causes those brain cells to break down. This, again, is another autosomal recessive disease, and so it's not like Huntington's where it's dominant, and it's not like sickle cell anemia where you can have both traits be displayed. But this is the only disease that can be controlled by diet, so you'll want to put a star by that. Really important to know. It's a genetic disease, but you can control it. You can do something about it. Whereas with these other diseases, there's really not that much you can do, okay? So here's a little picture describing PKU. What happens is a person that eats foods with phenylalanine in it, for example, a baby drinking milk, what happens is that you have a defective enzyme, an enzyme that doesn't break down the phen, or the Phe, right here. Eventually you have high levels of it in your body, so it starts building up. And then it leads to problems in thinking and behavior, so it actually affects your brain. So in a baby, the baby doesn't know that this is happening, and unless the family knows, they won't know to not allow the child to have a diet with phen or Phe in it. The next disorder we have mentioned before is hemophilia and color blindness. Both of these are recessive disorders, and they are also both sex-linked disorders. With this, you do need to know that they're recessive. You also need to know that there are no male carriers. Carriers for sex-linked diseases are only female. Notice that these two are sex-linked. You might want to bracket them together around the 6 and the 7 to make sure you know the difference. And we've talked about both of these before, so that's really all for our notes for today. You'll want to go back and look at the way the notes are set up. Number 1 is the only dominant disease that we have. Number 2 is the only co-dominant disorder that we have. 3, 4, and 5 are all recessive disorders, regular genetics, so a big A or a lowercase a. And here, for hemophilia and color blindness, they're sex-linked, so you have the male XY and the female XX. And the last thing here is for your summary, okay? For your summary, for some extra credit, if you do this portion, in your summary box, I want you to connect any Unit 3 vocab words to any of these diseases or disorders. So you'll want to look back at your pink vocab sheets, pick a word from there, pick one specific disease, and say how that word is related, or how you can use that word to help describe that disease. Make sure that you don't just use dominant or recessive, okay? Use one of the other terms that we've already talked about. There should be 2 different sentences and on 2 different diseases. But that's all for today.